Everyone, so we're going to do a quick tutorial of how to do our new Snuggle Penguin. You're going to need 3 pieces of black, 2 pieces of white, and 3 pieces of orange. The 2 blacks are going to be the front and back of your penguin. The 1 large white is going to be for his belly. The medium white is going to be the fronts of his wings. And the smaller black is going to be the back of his wings. The bigger oranges are going to be his feet, and this small orange is going to be his beak. So that's all the fabric that you need. And I've already loaded the parts files on my machine, so we'll go over there and run those now. So on the parts, you're going to have his feet and his wings. And so we're doing the 8x12, so I already have my stabilizer hoop. And we're going to run the first step, which is going to be his wings. On these, there's a placement stitch, so we're going to run that so that we know exactly how big we need our fabric to be. Okay, so now we have our placement stitch run on top of our stabilizer, and so now you can lay your fabric down. You're going to lay both pieces at the same time, so your tops and your bottoms. It doesn't matter which way you lay them because the wings will go the same way. And so since I want white on the front and black on the back, I'm going to lay them face together, right sides together, covering the area, and seal them up, and then we're going to run our tack down stitch. Okay, we've now finished stitching the tack down stitch, so our wings are all ready to go, and if you notice they're not stitched down here, that's to leave an opening to turn them. Now we're going to run our feet. They're going to be up a little higher, so we shouldn't have to trim, but it's a good idea just to get in the habit and get all this extra fabric out of the way just so your limbs and arms and ears aren't touching or overlapping each other. So now we're going to run the placement stitch for our feet. Okay, now we have our feet run, our placement stitch, so we can run our fabrics. So on these ones I'm using orange for both the front and the back of his feet. So I'm just going to lay this piece covering and run my tack down stitch, and then we'll be back. Okay, so now we have all of both our feet and both our wings stitched, so I'm going to unhoop this. Shut at me. The screw came from somewhere. And I'm going to cut these out, so I'm going to bring these over to my table. And when I cut these out, I'm going to pull the stabilizer off the back. There's no need for that. It's not really stabilizing anything. So I pull this off. And these littler threads, if they come out, that's no big deal because those were just our placement stitches. So now I'm going to cut out around this. I'm going to show, we're just going to go really close. And definitely do not cut into that or your seam will open up, and if you decide to stuff these, your stuffing will come out. And I leave a little bit of a tail up here because this is where we're going to sew it into the seam of the foot. So I just give it some space, and then I'm going to stick my thumbs in there and push this out and use a blunt object. These scissors are pretty blunt at the tip, so won't poke through. Get that one straight. So this foot is all ready to go in the body when we get to that part. So I'm going to set this aside. I'm going to cut out the rest of the pieces, and then I'll meet you back at the machine. Okay, so I wanted to show you really quick what I do on items that I'm going to turn that have rounded tips. I snip them up at the top around the curve as close to the seam as possible without snipping those threads. It just gives the fabric a little more flexibility so you don't get a really big bundled up piece in the middle. And then so we have our two wings and our 2 feet, and now we're going to go back over to the machine and get going on the body. Okay, so now our first stitch is going to be the placement stitch, and it's going to outline the entire penguin so that we can see where to lay our main body fabric. This fabric is going to be what's on the front when you look at the item. Okay, so now we have the placement stitch done for the penguin. So I'm going to lay over our main fabric. Again, this is going to be the front of his body. I've chosen Minky. I like fabrics that aren't completely flat like flannel or cotton. They show flaws when you close the seam. You're going to have to hand sew that shut. And it just hides flaws and bulkiness or weird bubbles if you use a thicker or textured fabric. Plus they just make them more lovable. So now we're going to run our tack down stitch, and that's going to secure this piece in place while we stitch the rest of him. Okay, we now have our placement or our tack down stitch completed. So this is securing our fabric in place because I do not like to hoop my fabric. It's just easier to float it right on top. So this tack down stitch just holds it in place. So now we're going to run the placement stitch for our white belly applique piece. Okay, we now have our placement stitch for his belly. You can see that right here. So now we're going to cover that with our white Minky fabric. I'm just going with the Minky theme here. So just enough to cover that. And now I'm going to use white so it blends right in with that. You can have an opposite color like black just to have it stick out. I'm going to use white for this example. And we'll get that stitched and be right back. Okay, so now we have our tack down stitch done. This is the final stitch for this particular applique. There will not be an satin stitch going across this. I chose not to use satin stitching on these Snuggle Buddies. I like the looks of the raw edges. They're quick stitch outs, and the kids like running their fingers over the edges of them, so it just works out all around. So what I do now is I cut as close as I can around this tack down stitch, even though we're not preparing it for a satin stitch. I like to use these duck-billed scissors. They're by Ginger. I got them at Joann's. You can use coupons on them, or they run them on sale quite often. And they're easy to work with in the hoop. They lay flat and allow me to get very close. If you're using a fabric like flannel that you want to fray, you might leave a little bit bigger of an area. That way it can fray around the edges. The more it gets washed, the more it frays, kind of like a rag quilt. But since I'm using Minky, it's not going to fray, and I like to keep it as close as possible. So I'm going to start cutting into this and show you how well these scissors work. You can take the hoop off of your machine if you choose, but I have quite a bit of room here to work with, so I just prefer to leave the hoop on. It keeps everything stable, so I just have to worry about the scissors. And there's some areas that might not get as close or as even as I want, but this area won't be sealed in any way. So after the whole guy is finished and off the hoop, I can go back and trim it when I don't have to worry about knocking it out of place. So I'm going to finish up this edge and then we'll be right back. Okay, now that we have our applique piece trimmed up and finished, we're going to move on to the next applique piece, which is his beak. So that's my placement stitch. I'm going to lay my fabric right over the top. And now it's going to stitch my placement stitch. Tack down stitch, sorry. So now I'm going to trim this piece. And I'm going to trim this the same I did on the other one. This is also going to be left just as it is, no satin stitch. And then we have one more applique piece that I forgot about, and all of our Snuggle Buddies have this star on their bellies, and so we need one more small piece of fabric. I'm going to run the placement stitch for this guy, and we just chose a small piece of purple. I'm going to run the tack down stitch on this star and trim it up, and then we'll be back. So now we have our star applique completed, and we're going to move on to his eyes, which will be the final piece of stitching before we get to the feet, attaching the feet and wings. So we're going to run these really quick. We'll be right back. Okay, we've now finished his eyes, his beak, his applique belly, his applique star, and we're ready to attach all of his limbs. So now we're going to take all the pieces that we started with at the beginning, and we're going to start attaching them one by one. So first up is the right wing, right facing. So I'm going to show you how we do that. First we run our placement stitch. It's usually good to use a contrasting color so that you can see exactly what stitch you're aiming for. Now on this, I want the white part of the wing facing forward when I'm looking at my finished penguin. So in order to do that, if I want my penguin to look like this, I'm going to lay these pieces like this. So like he's hugging himself. That way our raw edges are all out at the sides. So in order to do this, we have our placement stitches. Unfortunately, it's the same color as the placement stitch I used before. So it's hard to see, but it's this double outside line. So it's just a guide. Make sure part of the piece lands, if you want it up a little and it only holds this part down, that's fine, because this is going to stitch all the way around. For the final stitch, it'll hold it in place. So you can go up or down wherever you want these arms to stitch. So I'm going to put this one here, and then I'm going to run my tack down stitch, which is just going to hold it in place while we get our final fabrics placed. And make sure the raw edges are out, just like this. If you wanted to stuff them a little bit, you could do that before that stitch. Now it's too late. I like mine flappy. I like the little pieces so they're easy to hold on to. I'm going to go ahead and finish up the rest of the pieces and then we'll be back. Okay, I now have all the pieces stitched in place, so I'm ready for the final stitch out. If you're worried that your pieces might move when you're laying down your final piece of fabric, then I would suggest using some painter's tape or masking tape, something that isn't super strong. It removes easy, won't mess anything up. And I'm just, whoops, this has clearly been here a while. So I'm just going to lay this. I'll keep those wings there and the feet just so that it doesn't end up getting in the way of the seam. Because once you lay your final piece over, you're not going to be able to see what's going on underneath. So we chose black for our final piece, which I've lost. Hold on, we'll be back. Recut. Okay, so we're back. It was in a pile of Minky I just put away. So anyway, we have everything ready. It's taped. He's ready to go. I'm going to lay my final piece over the top. I'm going to put the good side facing down. Even though this is going on the very front of our stitch out, it's actually going to be the back of the penguin when we flip him right sides out. But you want to make sure the good side faces inward. I'm going to lay this down and make sure that none of the pieces got in the way, so I just kind of gently pull it back, and then I go to this side. I'm going to check and make sure that everything is still tucked in. And now we're going to run our final tack down stitch, and this is going to run from one side to the other and leave a small gap at the bottom where we can turn him. I like to use the same color thread as the main body fabric. That way when you're stitching it or flipping it, and if you see any of the seams, they'll blend right in. So I'm going to stitch this final stitch and then we'll be right back. Okay, we've now finished stitching our final stitch. As you can see, it's all sewn together and our stabilizer's on the back. We're going to bring it over here, and I'm going to unhoop it, and I'm going to do the same as I did before. I'm just going to pull the stabilizer off. I just used a light tearaway. It works great for in the hoop stuffies, because then I can pull it away and I don't have to worry about extras. And if you leave little pieces in there, it's not that big of a deal. They're not big enough to cause any craziness. If there's a lot of stitching, like the eyes aren't too bad, but if we had an eye and nose that were all fill stitched, you might want to add a second piece of tearaway under there just to stabilize that section, but for the most part, it's going to be just fine. So now we have our full stuffy. He's all still in there. So make sure his limbs are all sticking out just a bit. I should have checked that before I unhooped him. So they're all sticking out. There's 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now I'm going to cut close in here. You want a good pair of sturdy scissors. We're going to cut right through. And we're going to follow that tack together stitch. And make sure you're getting through both layers. That one jumped out for a second. And make sure not to cut those back fingers. For any hand cutting like this, I like to use these Fiskars, or I have another good pair of Gingers, all silver. But if I'm doing a lot of it, I prefer the Fiskars just because they're padded here. The Gingers are completely metal and they start to hurt after a while. But they cut like butter. So we have, whoopsie, I don't know what that piece is. And this. Trim up those extras. So now we have our whole penguin all stitched together. So I'm going to reach in, and I usually grab one of the appendages, but remember they're all taped together. So I'm going to pull this off so I can pull, actually that helped. And just start pulling him gently, and you can tuck from behind and just start stuffing everything. It all has to come out that small little opening. So now we have our amazing little penguin. And now you can stuff him if you want him to be more of a pillow, or like I mentioned before, you can trim up these extra pieces where you didn't get close enough because you were in the hoop still. So you can clean those up to make them a little more even. You can leave them to add character, whatever you prefer. There's a big piece over here. But trim him up however you like him. And then the only hand sewing you'll need to do is right at this edge here. After you stuff, if you choose to stuff him, flip the raw edges in and they'll line up just like the rest of it. And you can use a ladder stitch, which it'll basically whip stitch across it and it'll be for the most part invisible within the fabrics. Or what some people choose to do, if you don't like hand sewing or you don't have a consistent stitch, whatever it may be, some people like to put a top stitch with their sewing machine right around this upper edge here, or outer edge, not upper, just on the inside. It re-secures everything, makes it great so it'll lay flat. The problem is, usually when you do that, you'll iron it. Do not iron this minky or the dots will go away. So, yeah, we did learn that the hard way. So anyway, our penguin is all done, and I hope you guys like him. And check us out on www.loopyliondesigns.com. Mr. Penguin and the rest of his Snuggle Buddy friends are all available for sale now. So check him out and hope you have fun.